Hello and welcome to This Explainer. Today we're going to look at one of history's most terrifying technological failures. It's a dark, complex story about physics, human error, and a rigid regime that ultimately valued secrecy over safety. We are going to unpack the true anatomy of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster of 1986.
So I want you to think about this question. What happens when a system is designed to completely hide its own flaws? Because to truly grasp what happened at Chernobyl, we have to understand that this disaster was not just some simple operator error. It wasn't just a guy in a control room pushing the wrong button. It was a fatal, devastating intersection of unstable physics and intense political deception.
Section 1. The Soviet Nuclear Ambition. To understand how things went so disastrously wrong, we first need to look at the goals of the Soviet nuclear power program in the mid-20th century. They were driven by massive, rapidly growing power demands, especially in their densely populated industrial regions, so they turned heavily to atomic energy. To build power plants quickly and economically, the Soviet Union did something unique. They bypassed the massive, specialized steel pressure vessels that were standard in Western reactors. Instead, they built what's known as the RBMK, a channel-type reactor. This design was incredibly appealing because it allowed them to scale up to enormous power outputs using the industrial infrastructure they already had. They could even refuel the reactor while it was actively running. On paper, it was an absolute triumph of Soviet engineering. Section 2. The Night of the Disaster. The ticking clock of this tragedy actually begins with a routine safety test. The goal was simple enough: to see if a spinning turbine could provide about 45 seconds of bridging power to keep water pumps running just long enough for emergency diesel generators to kick in. Ironically, they had tried this exact test 3 times in previous years, and it failed every single time. At 1 p.m. on April 25th, operators reduced power to prep for the test. But then the Kyiv electricity grid called. Another power station had gone offline, so they asked Chernobyl to delay any further power reduction. They ended up holding the reactor at half power for 9 agonizing hours. And this delay was fatal. You see, during those 9 hours, the reactor started producing Xenon 135. That's a natural byproduct of fission, but it acts as a very powerful neutron absorber. Now, at full power, a reactor just burns that xenon off. But at half power, it builds up. The operators were unknowingly walking into what physicists call a xenon pit. By the time the test finally proceeded after midnight, the reactor's power plummeted uncontrollably to a near shutdown state of just 30 megawatts. Under immense institutional pressure to finally get this test done, the operators pulled almost all of the control rods entirely out of the reactor to try and overcome this xenon poisoning and force the power back up. Which leads us to this chilling number. At 1:23 and 40 seconds a.m., the emergency shutdown button, known as AZ5, was pressed. But instead of safely shutting the reactor down, the power surged to an estimated 30,000 megawatts in a fraction of a single second. Just to put that into perspective, that is roughly 10 times the reactor's maximum rated capacity. The result was a massive steam explosion that completely blew the 1,000-ton biological shield right off the top of the reactor, followed just seconds later by a second, even more devastating explosion.
Section 3. The fatal reactor flaw.
So, what exactly turned a routine safety shutdown into a bomb? How does pressing an emergency stop button destroy the entire machine? Well, it essentially comes down to 2 fatal design flaws in the RBMK. The first is something called a positive void coefficient. In Western reactors, water acts as both the coolant and the moderator being the material that slows down neutrons so fission can actually happen. In those reactors, if you lose water, you lose the moderator and the reaction simply stops. But in the RBMK, water was just the coolant. The moderator consisted of massive graphite blocks. So when the power began to rise during the test, the cooling water quickly boiled into steam voids. Steam doesn't absorb neutrons nearly as well as liquid water does, but that graphite was still right there, doing its job, keeping the reaction going. This meant less water led to more fission, which created more heat, which caused even more boiling. It was an unstoppable, runaway physical loop. And then we have the second, perhaps most lethal flaw. The control rods, which are specifically meant to absorb neutrons and kill the reaction, were actually tipped with graphite. When the operators hit that AZ5 button, all those fully withdrawn control rods began dropping back into the core. But those graphite tips entered first. And remember, graphite accelerates the reaction, so for a few agonizing seconds, the very mechanism designed to stop the reactor actually caused a massive spike in reactivity. It was a literal trap that the operators unknowingly walked right into. And to make matters catastrophically worse, there was no secure Western-style containment building built around the reactor to hold that explosion in. Section 4. The immediate aftermath. At this point, Reactor 4's core was completely exposed to the open air. It was vomiting 5.6 roentgens of radiation per second out into the environment. That is enough to deliver a lethal dose to a human being in under a minute. The very first people to face this invisible fire were the local firefighters from the nearby town of Pripyat. They had no idea they were fighting a nuclear core fire. They literally just thought the roof was burning. One of those exceptionally brave men was Vasily Ignatendo. He received a massive, fatal dose of radiation standing on the roof of that reactor, and he died in absolute agony 2 weeks later in a Moscow hospital. The quote here from his wife Ludmila is just absolutely heartbreaking. His body was so swollen from acute radiation sickness that they couldn't even put shoes on him for his funeral. He had to be buried in a zinc casket, fully encased in concrete, because his remains were so incredibly radioactive. The insane heat of the disaster actually melted the nuclear fuel, the concrete, and the metal of the reactor all together into a highly radioactive lava called corium. Months later, dosimetrists who are brave enough to venture into the pitch-black destroyed subcorridors of the plant discovered this massive wrinkled formation of black ceramic material. They nicknamed it the elephant's foot. At the time they found it, it was emitting roughly 10,000 roentgens per hour. Being in the same room with it for just 3 minutes would guarantee your death. Section 5. The deadly cover-up. Now, while these heroes were giving their lives on the ground, a systemic, institutional cover-up was already unfolding up in the Kremlin. 49,000. That was the population of Pripyat, located a mere 3 kilometers from the burning reactor. For 36 straight hours after the explosion, the Soviet government said absolutely nothing. Kids played outside, a wedding took place, and citizens just went about their normal day under a massive, invisible, radioactive plume. When the evacuation finally did happen, people were told to pack for just 3 days. Of course, they never returned. Declassified documents that came to light years later reveal the staggering depth of these lies. Just look at this excerpt from a top-secret Politburo protocol from early May. Privately, the very highest levels of the Soviet leadership were tracking thousands of hospitalizations and hundreds of severe radiation sickness cases. Yet publicly, they were broadcasting on the news that everything was perfectly under control and that the health of the population was in no way threatened. The most deadly isotope leaked at Chernobyl wasn't just cesium-137. As one journalist perfectly put it later on, it was Deception 86. But a disaster of this scale was impossible to hide from the globe for long. 2 days after the explosion, radiation alarms started going off at a nuclear plant in Sweden, which finally forced the Soviets to admit that an accident had occurred. The environmental cost was just catastrophic. 485 villages in neighboring Belarus had to be permanently abandoned. To even begin containing the disaster, the Soviet Union deployed an estimated 600,000 liquidators. These were miners, soldiers, and civilian volunteers. The radiation levels were so incredibly high that the robotics they sent to clean the roof had their electronic circuits instantly fried. So they had to rely on biorobots. Military reservists literally ran out onto the roof to shovel highly radioactive graphite by hand, working in frantic 90-second shifts. Section 6. Legacy and Modern Chernobyl. So what did the engineering and political world actually learn from the ashes of Reactor 4? Looking at the immediate technical fixes, the disaster undeniably proved that the RBMK's design was inherently flawed, something the original designers actually knew but had intentionally kept hidden. Following intense investigations by the International Atomic Energy Agency, the remaining Soviet RBMK reactors were fundamentally altered. The control rods were completely redesigned so those graphite tips couldn't cause that fatal initial reactivity spike anymore. They also increased the enrichment of the uranium fuel from 2.0% to 2.4%, which changed the neutron physics and significantly reduced that terrifying positive void coefficient. Now, this didn't make them perfectly safe by standard Western metrics, but it did definitively eliminate the exact cascade of conditions that destroyed Unit 4. If you visit the site today, it is dominated by an absolute marvel of modern engineering. The original concrete sarcophagus, which was built so hastily by the Liquidators back in 1986, was deteriorating rapidly. So a huge international consortium funded and built what is called the new safe confinement. It's this massive, arch-shaped structure that was quite literally slid over the old reactor to isolate the highly radioactive remains and protect the environment for at least the next century. But beyond the concrete, the steel, and the radiation, Chernobyl's legacy is profoundly political. Years later, Mikhail Gorbachev stated that the disaster was perhaps the real cause of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it's easy to see why. The explosion utterly shattered the myth of Soviet technological competence. The delayed evacuation and the blatant, documented lies undermined the state's legitimacy in the eyes of its own citizens and the entire world, in a way that it could simply never recover from.
Which brings us to our final thought. The operators standing in that control room that night did not want to blow up a reactor. They were just doing their jobs, trapped within a system that had decided certain crucial safety information was simply too embarrassing to share. So I leave you with this. Is your system, whether it's an organization you work for, a government you live under, or a piece of technology you use every day, designed so the truth is never withheld from the people who need it most? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. If you found this deep dive into the anatomy of the Chernobyl disaster insightful, please make sure to subscribe. We have many more fascinating history and technology documentaries coming up that you absolutely won't want to miss. See you next time.